Jack was 30 years old, but the years had not carved many lines into his face. Instead, his solitude had smoothed him into a quiet figure, steady as the land he lived on. He made his home in a cabin of weathered pine, perched on the edge of the forest where the trees stood like sentinels, dark and eternal. The cabin wasn't much, a single room with a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, a cot, and a small window that faced west. But it was enough for Jack. Enough for a man who had decided long ago that the company of birds and rivers was preferable to the sharp tongues of people. Every morning, he rose with the first light that slipped over the hills. He would boil water on the hearth, pour it into a tin cup, and drink it plain. Coffee was a luxury, and luxuries belonged to men who lived closer to town. Jack's pleasures were simpler. After a meal of cornbread or fish left from the night before, he took up his rod and walked down to the stream that cut through the valley. The water there was cold, swift, and clean, fed by mountain snow. The trout practically gleamed like polished silver when he pulled them from the water, their bodies writhing against the morning light. The stream always calmed him. The rippling water, the dart of minnows, the reflection of clouds as they sailed across the sky, it gave him the kind of peace no sermon or saloon could ever offer. Jack was not a churchgoer, not anymore. He figured God, if he were watching, was more likely to be found in the quiet bend of the river than in the mouths of gossiping men. After fishing, Jack would return to his cabin. He cleaned the catch carefully, cooking what he needed for the day in a skillet blackened from years of use. He ate with slow patience, staring out the window at the line of trees swaying in the afternoon wind. Then came the small chores of a solitary life, mending the fence, chopping wood, patching leaks in the roof. It was never much, but it kept his hands busy and his thoughts quiet. For in the silence, thoughts had a way of drifting back to town, the one place he had left behind with no intention of returning. He had once tried to live among people. There had been a season where he thought maybe he could stand the noise of wagons and the smell of sweat in crowded saloons. But people, he learned, could be cruel in ways harsher than hunger. Jack had never courted a woman, never even held one's hand. And in a town where reputations were traded like cards at a table, that absence became a brand on his back. They called him names, the virgin rancher, the shy brat. Some jeered, others whispered. But all of it weighed on him until the laughter dug deeper than any knife. Jack had endured it quietly at first, but mockery is a seed. Left unchecked, it grows. Soon he realized he had no desire to fight for their respect. So he walked away from the town, away from their judgment, and into the woods where no one cared who he was or what he hadn't done. Here in his cabin, no voices haunted him but the call of the meadowlark and the howl of coyotes on a winter's night. The land itself was enough to fill his heart. The sunsets were fire spilled across the sky, streaking orange and red over the wide plains. At dawn, mist curled low across the fields, soft as a veil, and when the sun burned it away, the earth glittered as though 1,000 diamonds had been sown in the grass. Deer passed through the valley, stepping cautiously, their silhouettes glowing golden against the horizon. Jack noticed these things. He always had. Where other men sought gold or whiskey or women, he found wonder in the small turnings of the world, a hawk riding the wind, the rhythm of rain against the roof, the crackle of firewood in the hearth. Beauty was all around him if a man only had the patience to look. But though he had beauty, he did not have love. Love was a word Jack rarely allowed into his thoughts. It felt like something meant for other men braver, bolder, less strange. His life had been untouched by tenderness, and in time, he convinced himself he didn't need it. The woods provided enough. The land sustained him. Loneliness was a kind of silence, and silence was his comfort. Yet beneath all that, there lingered something he never admitted even to himself. A hollow place. A question unanswered. What would it be like to share this quiet life with another soul? To have laughter echo against his cabin walls instead of only the hiss of wind? He buried that thought deep, but sometimes in the stillness between dusk and dawn it rose like a ghost he could not shake. Jack pushed such thoughts away. Better to live untouched than risk the cruelty of people again. So he sat on his porch as the day fell into twilight, the horizon burning with gold, the forest alive with the hum of cicadas. Alone but steady. Alone but observant. Alone but alive. The rancher Jack believed this was the life he was meant to live. What he did not know was that fate had already set its hand upon him, and his solitude was about to be broken by the most unexpected encounter of his life. The forest had always been Jack's sanctuary. It was a place where time moved slower, where a man could hear the creak of branches or the flutter of a sparrow's wings, and know the world still held order. That morning he wandered farther than usual. The sun was rising, spilling shafts of light between the tall pines. He walked with his hands tucked in his pockets, breathing in the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Every so often he paused, watching a squirrel dart along a branch or listening to the low whistle of wind through the leaves. The air was crisp, carrying with it the freshness that only autumn mornings knew. Jack liked to lose himself in this stillness. Out here there were no voices calling him names, no laughter mocking his solitude. Just the steady rhythm of his boots pressing into soil and the whisper of nature surrounding him. But that morning, something different lay waiting. At first, he thought it was only a bundle of cloth beneath the shadow of a tree, a trick of the forest floor. Yet as he drew closer, he saw the outline of a body. He stopped short, his breath catching. It was a woman. She lay sprawled against the roots of a wide oak, her long dark hair tangled like a curtain across her face. Her dress, woven of soft leather and cloth, was torn at the hem, dirt-streaked as though she had traveled far. Her skin glistened with sweat, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Jack crouched down, his calloused hand hovering above her forehead before he finally dared to touch. Heat. Fevered heat, so strong it startled him. Jack pulled back as though the contact had burned him. His heart thudded in his chest. 100 thoughts raced through his mind. Who was she? Where had she come from? Was she lost from her people, or had some misfortune driven her into the woods? But louder than all those questions was the voice of caution. This was not his concern. He had spent years avoiding human entanglements, avoiding the pain that came with them. He should leave her, he told himself. Someone else would find her. Perhaps her people were nearby. He stood, took a step back, then another. His instinct screamed for distance. A man alone was safest when he remained alone, and yet he could not move farther. There was something about her face, even shrouded by fever, that rooted him to the spot. Her features were delicate yet strong, her lips parted as though caught in the middle of a word. In that moment she looked less like a stranger and more like a soul caught between this world and the next. Jack's chest tightened. He had known hunger, exhaustion, even the sting of humiliation, but he had never known what it was to stand over another human being and feel responsible for their next breath. The longer he looked, the harder it became to turn away. Damn it, he muttered under his breath, dragging a hand through his unkempt hair. Kneeling again, he slipped his arms beneath her slight frame. She was light, far lighter than he expected, as though the fever had burned away her strength. The moment her weight rested against him, Jack felt a jolt, an unfamiliar closeness, the warmth of another body pressed against his. He hadn't touched another soul in years. His chest ached with the strangeness of it, but his arms tightened instinctively, securing her as though she might vanish if he loosened his grip. She stirred faintly, a soft sound leaving her lips, but her eyes never opened. Jack rose with her in his arms. The forest around him seemed different now, no longer a quiet refuge, but a witness to a turning point he didn't understand. Each step he took back toward his cabin echoed with the weight of choice. He could not explain why he carried her, why he risked shattering the fragile peace he had built. He only knew that leaving her would have been impossible. The path wound uphill, the trees parting in places to reveal glimpses of sky. Jack moved carefully, his breath steady but his heart pounding faster than it ever did on long walks alone. Her head rested against his chest, her fevered breath warm through his shirt. For the first time in his life, silence didn't feel like solitude. It felt like responsibility, like a bond he had not chosen but one that had chosen him. By the time his cabin came into view, the sun was high and the sweat on his brow mingled with the weight of the woman he carried. He shifted her gently in his arms, pausing for a moment to catch his breath. The small wooden structure looked different now, less like a shelter for one man and more like a place about to hold a story greater than his own. Jack pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepping inside. The hearth was cold, the room quiet as always, but now it was no longer empty. He lowered her carefully onto his cot, her dark hair fanning out against the worn blanket. For a long moment he simply stood over her, his hand braced on the edge of the bed, trying to understand what he had just done. A strange feeling stirred in him, something between fear and wonder. Fate had never been a word Jack trusted, but as he watched her breathing shallow and fragile in his cabin, he could not shake the sense that something larger than himself had begun. He had gone into the forest a solitary man, certain of his path. He returned carrying the weight of another soul, and nothing in him felt the same. The cabin had never felt so small. Jack moved quickly, setting her on the cot, then crouching beside her with a strange, uncertain urgency. Her skin was hot to the touch, hotter than any fever he had ever known. She tossed her head weakly, a faint sound escaping her lips, a murmur too soft to catch. Jack's life had been built on routines: catch a fish, mend a fence, light a fire. But now there was no routine to follow, only instinct. He fetched a basin from the corner, filled it with cool water from the bucket he kept by the door, and tore a strip of cloth from one of his older shirts. Dipping the fabric, he wrung it out and laid it across her brow. The cloth warmed almost instantly. He replaced it again and again until the skin beneath seemed to cool by the smallest degree. He felt clumsy, awkward. Caring for another human being was not something his hands knew. These hands were meant for rope and wood, for casting lines into the river, not for tending to the fragile form of a woman burning with sickness. And yet the longer he worked, the more natural it became. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire he lit in the hearth. The storm came in the late afternoon. He had seen the clouds gathering earlier, heavy and dark, rolling low over the horizon. By the time the first drop struck the roof, he was seated beside her, spooning broth from a pot he had hastily prepared. "Just a little," he muttered, as though she could hear him. He slid one arm beneath her shoulders, lifting her just enough to bring the spoon to her lips. Most of it spilled down her chin, but some found its way into her mouth. She swallowed weakly, her throat moving, and Jack let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The storm raged harder, wind howling through the trees, rain battering the roof, thunder cracked across the valley, making the window rattle in its frame. Jack barely noticed. His entire world had shrunk to the narrow cot, the fevered woman lying upon it, and the sound of her faint breathing. Every so often she murmured in her sleep, words in a tongue he didn't understand. The syllables were soft, musical even, though tinged with pain. He leaned closer, straining to catch them, though it was hopeless. He wondered what she dreamed of. Was it her people she called for? Some memory from her life before this fever dragged her down? Jack sat back, running a hand across his face. The storm outside pressed heavy against the walls, but inside, another storm churned in him. Responsibility, fear, and something else, something he couldn't name. All his life, he had been untouched, not just by love, but by the simplest act of closeness. Now here was a stranger in his bed, her breath shallow, her life balanced between his hands and fate. The warmth he felt for her startled him, but it was undeniable. He wanted her to live. He needed her to live. Not because of duty alone, but because something inside him, long starved and silent, was stirring awake. He shifted the cloth on her forehead again, brushing strands of hair gently away from her face. Her skin was damp, her lashes trembling faintly. She was beautiful, though not in a way that demanded attention. It was a quiet beauty, a strength hidden even in her weakness. The hours dragged into night. Jack did not sleep. He fed the fire, replaced the cloths, coaxed her to swallow another spoonful of broth whenever she stirred. The storm outside battered the world, but inside there was only the two of them. Near midnight, thunder rolled so loud it shook the ground. Jack, half dozing in the chair beside the bed, startled awake. He leaned forward instinctively, his eyes finding her face. And then, her eyes opened. Not wide, not fully, but just enough. Dark eyes glistening with confusion locked onto his. For a moment the storm, the world, everything fell away. She blinked slowly as though unsure if he was real, then parted her lips. No words came, only a faint exhale before her eyes fluttered shut again. Jack sat frozen. His heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow. That brief look had been like a spark in the dark, fleeting, fragile, but powerful enough to ignite something he could not contain. He leaned back, pressing a hand to his chest as though to steady the storm inside him. She had seen him. In her fevered haze, she had looked at him, not as a stranger hovering over her, but as though he were something more. Outside, the rain poured harder, drumming steady against the cabin roof. Inside, Jack sat vigil by the woman's side, his eyes heavy but his resolve firm. He would not leave her, not until the fever broke, not until she opened her eyes again, not in confusion this time, but in recognition. The fever broke on the third morning. Jack had been running on little more than determination, his eyes hollow from lack of sleep when he noticed the change. Her breathing had steadied. Her skin no longer burned against the cool cloths he laid upon her brow. She stirred, shifting beneath the blanket, and this time when her eyes opened, they remained open. Jack froze in the chair beside the cot. For days he had watched her slip in and out of fevered dreams, never certain if she would survive to see the dawn. Now she was awake, truly awake, and watching him. Her eyes were dark, alert, yet cautious, like a doe unsure whether to bolt. She tried to sit, but the effort drained her, and Jack instinctively reached forward, his rough hands hovering uncertainly before supporting her shoulders. "Easy," he murmured, his voice quieter than he expected. "You've been sick. Best not to push yourself." For a moment she only looked at him, studying the stranger who had kept her alive. Her lips parted, the words raspy but clear. "Where am I?" "My cabin," Jack replied. He pulled the chair closer, settling down so he didn't loom over her. "Found you in the forest. Fever near took you." She blinked as though piecing his words together through the fog of weakness. "You stayed?" Jack gave a small awkward shrug. "Couldn't leave you there." Her gaze softened, though it still held that guarded edge. She adjusted the blanket over herself, her voice a whisper when she spoke again. "My name is Ahyoka." The word carried weight, melodic and strong. Jack repeated it carefully, almost reverently, afraid of marring it with his clumsy tongue. "Ahyoka," he nodded once. "Name's Jack." Silence lingered, filled by the crackle of the fire and the soft patter of rain outside. Then she leaned back, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again. "I was traveling. With my people. We were moving south for the season. I fell ill. Couldn't keep up. I told them to go on, that I would catch up." She paused, breath shaky. "I never did." Jack listened, his rough hands folded tightly in his lap. "So you've been out there alone all this time?" Ahyoka gave a faint nod. "The fever came stronger than I expected." Her eyes flicked to him, searching. "If you hadn't found me." She let the rest trail off. He shifted, uncomfortable beneath the weight of her gratitude. "Don't think on it. You're here now. That's what matters." She studied him again, as though trying to read not just his face but the silence around him. Finally, she offered a small, tired smile. "Thank you, Jack." The words settled in his chest like a warmth he hadn't known he'd been missing. The days that followed carried a rhythm unlike anything Jack had ever lived. He gathered herbs and boiled them into teas, feeding her broth when she was too weak to hold the spoon herself. With each passing day she gained strength, her voice growing clearer, her eyes sharper. Soon she could sit by the hearth wrapped in a blanket, while Jack busied himself with simple tasks. They spoke in fragments at first. Short questions, short answers. Jack wasn't a man of many words, and Ahyoka seemed to respect that. But slowly, conversation found its way between them. She told him of her people's traditions, of the way the stars guided them on their journeys. He told her of the valley, the best fishing spots, the way the deer moved at dawn. Sometimes silence fell between them, but it was no longer the heavy silence Jack had lived with for years. It was companionable, a space shared rather than endured. One evening, when the fever had long passed, they shared a simple meal of fish and cornbread. Afterward, Ahyoka stepped outside, her bare feet brushing against the cool grass. Jack followed, unsure why, and they stood side by side watching the sky burn with sunset. The horizon stretched endless, painted with streaks of red and gold, and for the first time in his life, Jack didn't watch it alone. Ahyoka tilted her face to the wind, her hair lifting gently. "Your land is beautiful," she said softly. Jack swallowed, his throat tight. "Never thought of it as mine. Just a place I ended up." She turned to him, her smile faint but steady. "Then perhaps it was meant for you." He didn't answer, but the words sank deep. Over the next week, laughter found its way into the cabin. Not loud or constant, but sudden and surprising. Ahyoka chuckling at Jack's clumsy attempts to describe the quirks of a wild fox. Jack shaking his head with a sheepish grin when she teased him about his cooking. The sound of laughter in his cabin was something new, and every time it came, Jack felt as though the walls themselves grew warmer. For the first time in his 30 years, Jack felt alive in a way that fishing and sunsets alone could not give him. He couldn't name it, not yet, but it lingered in his chest whenever Ahyoka's eyes met his, whenever their silence stretched comfortably into the evening. He had lived untouched, unseen. Now with her presence, the world itself seemed fuller, richer, as though some missing piece had quietly slipped into place. The days stretched into weeks, and though Ahyoka's strength returned with each sunrise, Jack found his own heart caught in a different kind of fever. He had grown used to her presence, the sound of her voice when she spoke of stars and rivers, the lightness of her laughter, the quiet way she sat beside him at sunset. Yet comfort was not the only thing she stirred in him. With her came fear. Fear of what the world beyond his cabin would say. Fear of what might happen if she chose to leave and he was left to the silence once more. Fear that he, a man mocked as a coward and a loner, was unworthy of someone who carried herself with such quiet strength. At night, when she slept on the cot and the fire burned low, Jack would sit on the porch staring at the dark line of trees. He told himself he could not let his thoughts wander toward love. Love was for men braver than him, men who had not fled from the laughter of others. If word reached town that Jack, the virgin rancher, had taken in a native woman, the whispers would return sharper than ever. They would not see kindness or decency in his actions. They would see weakness, folly. Yet even as those fears circled, the truth pressed against him. He did not want her to leave. Ahyoka, for her part, seemed to sense his turmoil. She watched him with eyes that missed little, and when silence stretched too long, she would gently prod him from it. "You carry much here," she said once, tapping her chest softly as they sat by the fire. Jack glanced at her, startled, then looked away. Not much worth telling. She tilted her head, her expression calm, unpressing. Silence is a kind of armor, but armor can grow heavy. Her words lingered with him, long after the fire had burned low. The outside world, however, was not content to leave them untouched. One afternoon, Jack spotted smoke on the far horizon, settlers or perhaps drifters passing through. He knew what it meant. Where men gathered, trouble often followed. Prejudice ran deep in those who saw difference as threat. And Jack's cabin, though secluded, was not beyond discovery. He kept those thoughts to himself, though his hand lingered longer on the rifle propped by the door. Danger, when it came, was not from men but from the forest itself. It was near dusk when the first growl split the air. Jack and Ahyoka had gone to the stream together, she walking more steadily now, though still leaning on him when the ground grew uneven. Jack had just reeled in a fine trout when the sound came again. Low, rumbling, predatory. His hand froze on the line. Slowly he turned his head. From the shadowed edge of the trees emerged a wolf, its coat dark, eyes glowing with hunger. A second followed, then a third, their bodies lean from the hard season. Ahyoka stiffened beside him. Jack shifted, stepping slightly in front of her without thought. "Stay close," he murmured. His hand slid to the rifle slung across his back. The wolves crept forward, paws silent against the earth, teeth bared. The largest let out a snarl that vibrated in Jack's bones. He had hunted before, but this was different. This was no game, no pursuit. It was a standoff, and Ahyoka's safety depended on him. He raised the rifle slowly, heart hammering. The first shot cracked across the valley, striking the lead wolf and sending the others scattering with sharp yelps. The echo rolled like thunder, but Jack didn't lower the gun until the forest swallowed the shadows once more. Silence fell, broken only by the stream's steady rush. Jack exhaled, shoulders tense, then turned to Ahyoka. "You all right?" She nodded, eyes wide, but instead of fear there was something else in her gaze, something steady, something proud. She reached out, her hand brushing his arm lightly. "You stood like the oak, strong, unshaken." Jack's throat tightened. He wanted to shrug it off, to make light of it, but the way she looked at him made the words impossible. He simply nodded, his chest heavy with an emotion he could not name. That night, as they sat by the fire, Ahyoka spoke softly. "Where I come from, we say a man's spirit is shown when he faces danger not for himself but for another." She paused, her eyes fixed on him. "Your spirit has spoken." Jack shifted uncomfortably, staring into the flames. He had not acted for glory or pride. He had acted because losing her was unthinkable. Still, hearing it said aloud sent warmth through him that no fire could match. The bond between them deepened after that night. Their silences grew more intimate, their laughter freer. Yet even as Jack's heart leaned toward hers, the words remained unspoken. He feared them, feared what they might unleash. But every time her eyes met his across the flicker of firelight, he knew the truth lingered just beyond his silence. Unspoken, but undeniable. The fire had burned low, its glow painting the cabin walls in shades of amber and shadow. Outside, the night was calm, the forest alive only with the distant call of owls and the sigh of wind through the trees. Jack sat in his chair, boots resting on the worn floorboards, his rifle leaning idle by the door. Across from him, Ahyoka sat wrapped in a blanket, her dark hair falling loosely about her shoulders. They had eaten in silence, a simple meal of fish and wild roots, but Jack noticed something different in her tonight. Her eyes held a depth, a quiet pull, as though she had carried words too long and had chosen this night to release them. "Jack," she began softly, her voice steady despite the weight of her tone. "Among my people, we believe every soul is bound to another. Two spirits woven by destiny, drawn together across time and distance. We call them the chosen ones." Jack looked up from the fire, his brow furrowed. He shifted in his chair, unsure what to say. "Chosen ones?" She nodded, her gaze steady on him. "Not by chance, not by choice, by the will of something greater. Some meet their chosen early in life, some late, some never find them. But when they do, it is as if the world itself points and says, 'This one.'" Jack leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wanted to dismiss it, to shake his head and say such tales belonged to dreams, not to men who chopped wood and mended fences. Yet the way she spoke, with reverence and certainty, made the words settle in him like seeds. He poked the fire with an iron rod, watching sparks leap upward. "Seems a mighty thing to say a life's already set. I've lived 30 years on my own. Don't much feel like destiny's ever looked my way." Ahyoka tilted her head, her smile faint but knowing. "Perhaps you mistook solitude for freedom." The word struck harder than he expected. Jack looked away, staring at the flames. Freedom. That was what he had always told himself he had chosen. Yet now in her presence, the silence of those years seemed less like freedom and more like a hollow echo. "You believe this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she said simply, "with all that I am." The fire burned lower, and eventually Jack rose to bank it for the night. He had just turned when he heard her soft gasp. Ahyoka had tried to stand, but her body betrayed her. She swayed, her hand clutching the edge of the table, her strength faltering. Jack was at her side in an instant, his arm slipping around her to steady her. "Easy," he said, his voice low, concerned. "You're still healing." She leaned into him, her breath shallow. For a heartbeat, their closeness seemed to fill the room more than the fire's glow ever had. He could feel the warmth of her body, the fragility of her frame, the tremor of exhaustion in her limbs. Her head lifted just enough for her eyes to meet his. Dark, luminous, filled with something more than weariness. Her lips parted, the words escaping in a whisper so soft he almost thought he imagined them. "My chosen one." Jack froze, every muscle taut. The world seemed to narrow until it was only those three words echoing in his ears. Heavier than thunder, gentler than rain. "My chosen one." For a long moment he could not breathe. Her gaze did not waver, even as her body sagged against him with fatigue. He laid her gently back onto the cot, covering her with the blanket, but his mind reeled. When she closed her eyes, slipping into rest, Jack remained standing over her, hands clenched at his sides. He had spent his life convinced solitude was his shield, convinced love was something he could live without. Yet in those words, whispered through her weakness, something inside him cracked wide open. He sat back heavily in the chair, staring at her sleeping face. His solitude had never been freedom. It had been emptiness, an emptiness waiting all these years for this. For her the night deepened. The fire sank to embers, yet Jack did not move. His eyes remained fixed on Ahyoka, his mind circling her words like a hawk riding the currents of wind. A tension had taken root between them, gentle, respectful, but undeniable. He did not reach for her, nor she for him. Yet the air seemed charged, as if every unspoken word, every stolen glance, had been building to this. Jack had never believed in destiny. But now, sitting in the quiet glow of the dying fire, he could no longer deny that something greater had led her into his life. Whether he was ready or not, his heart had already begun to answer hers. The days following Ahyoka's whispered words passed like a dream Jack could not quite grasp. He carried them with him in silence, my chosen one, each syllable echoing through the rhythm of his chores, through the quiet meals they shared, through the way her presence had begun to shape every corner of his once empty life. But as peace grew between them, so too did unease. The smoke on the horizon he had noticed weeks ago had not been forgotten. Trails cut by wagons had grown fresher, and once, while fishing near the stream, he found footprints, boot prints, not moccasin. Strangers were near, settlers, drifters, perhaps worse. He kept his concerns hidden from Ahyoka, but his eyes lingered on the rifle more often. His ears sharpened to every sound in the forest. Solitude had once been his shield. Now with her, it had become something fragile, something that could be broken. The trouble came on a late afternoon when the air was heavy with the promise of rain. Jack was chopping wood behind the cabin when he heard the creak of wagon wheels and the low murmur of voices. He froze, axe half raised, heart thudding. The voices grew louder. By the time he rounded the cabin, 3 men had already ridden up on horseback. Their clothes were rough, their eyes sharper still. Strangers, but with the look of men who had seen too many taverns and too few churches. Well now, the first one drawled, sliding from his saddle. Didn't expect to find company way out here. His gaze swept over the cabin, then stopped at the figure standing in the doorway. Ahyoka, wrapped in her blanket, watching silently. The man's grin widened. "And what do we have here?" Jack stepped forward, the axe still in his hand. "She's no business of yours," he said evenly. The second man laughed, spitting into the dirt. "Looks to me like you've taken in a squaw. That right, rancher? Thought you were the type to live alone." The words struck a chord, echoes of the mockery he'd fled from years ago. Virgin brat. Shy coward. His knuckles tightened on the axe handle, but he held his ground. "Best you move along," Jack said, his voice low, steady. The third man dismounted, his expression darker than the others. "We'll move along when we're ready. Ain't every day you see something worth taking out here." His eyes flicked to Ahyoka, and Jack felt a fire ignite in his chest. He set the axe down slowly, deliberately, then walked toward the door. His hand found the rifle propped just inside, and when he stepped back out, the barrel gleamed beneath the gathering storm clouds. "You'll ride on," Jack said, the words like iron. "Now." For a tense moment, silence hung between them. The men exchanged glances. The first smirked, the second scowled, the third spat. "You ain't got the spine for this," the leader sneered. "You're just a loner playing at being a man." The insult might once have cut him to the bone, but not now. Jack's gaze did not waver, his stance unshaken. "Try me." The second man shifted in his saddle, hand twitching near his holster. Jack raised the rifle, the click of the hammer echoing loud and clear. The storm broke then, a rumble of thunder rolling across the valley as the first drops of rain began to fall. The horses shifted nervously, ears flicking. The 3 men hesitated, reading not just the gun in Jack's hands but the resolve in his eyes. It was Ahyoka who moved next. She stepped forward from the doorway, her voice steady, strong. "Go! You carry no honor here." The words, spoken with such quiet authority, seemed to strike deeper than Jack's rifle ever could. The leader spat into the mud, scowled, then swung back into his saddle. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. One by one, the men turned their horses, riding off into the darkening forest. Jack didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves faded into silence. His shoulders sagged with the release of tension, his breath unsteady. He turned toward Ahyoka. She stood calm, though her eyes shimmered with something between pride and concern. "You could have been killed," she said softly. Jack shook his head, rain dripping from his hair. "Not while you're here." Her lips parted, a faint tremor of emotion crossing her face. For a long moment they simply stood there. 2 souls bound not by chance but by choice made in the face of danger. The man who had once run from gossip, from ridicule, had now stood firm against real threat. He had chosen not solitude, not safety, but protection. He had chosen her. Inside the cabin, as the storm raged outside, Jack sat by the fire with Ahyoka close beside him. For the first time, the weight of his loneliness no longer pressed upon him. In its place was something heavier yet far sweeter, the knowledge that he had something worth defending, and defend it he would. Always. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean, Raindrops clung to pine needles glimmering in the light of morning. The air was crisp, carrying the rich scent of damp earth, and the forest itself seemed to breathe easier, as if relieved the tension had broken with the thunder. Inside the cabin, Jack sat at the table, polishing the rifle that had defended them. Ahyoka moved quietly about the room, her steps lighter than they had been since he first carried her there. Though her illness had weakened her once, she now seemed steadier, her strength returning with each day. For the first time in years, Jack felt a strange, deep calm. The fear of mockery, of loneliness, of being less than the man he ought to be, those shadows no longer clung to him. He had faced danger, not only with a gun in his hands but with his heart laid bare, and in doing so he had found something he never thought possible, a sense of belonging. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its descent, Ahyoka joined him on the porch. The wood beneath them was still damp, but neither cared. The horizon stretched wide, painted in hues of gold and rose. Clouds lit like lanterns drifting in the sky. Birds flitted from branch to branch, their songs weaving through the silence. For a while they simply sat. Jack's hat rested in his lap, his calloused hands folded over it. Beside him, Ahyoka wrapped her blanket around her shoulders, her dark eyes fixed on the glowing sky. At last she spoke, her voice quiet but sure. "You wonder still if fate is real?" Jack turned his head toward her, a faint smile tugging his lips. "I'm not much for things I can't see with my own eyes." "And yet," she said, her gaze sliding to meet his, "you saw me lying in the forest that day. You could have walked on, but you did not. Something pulled you, something greater than choice." He breathed in deeply, remembering that moment. The stillness of the trees, the fever burning her skin as he lifted her, the pounding of his own heart as he carried her home. He had told himself it was duty, compassion, but in truth it had been more. Something deeper, unspoken. "You believe it was fate?" he said softly. "I know it," she replied. "My people teach that when a soul finds its other, the world changes. The river flows clearer. The stars shine brighter. The heart once empty beats with meaning. You are that for me, Jack. My chosen one." Her words settled over him like the last rays of sun across the valley. Warm, undeniable, life-giving. For so long, he had let others define him. A loner, a coward, a man unworthy of love. But here, in her eyes, he was seen differently. Not as less, but as whole. He reached for her hand, rough palm meeting soft fingers. "All my life I thought I was free because I was alone," he said, voice thick. "But I see now I wasn't free. I was empty, and you filled that emptiness." Her fingers curled into his, steady and sheer. Jack drew in a breath, the words coming not from his mind but from somewhere deeper. "You're my chosen one too, Ahyoka." Her lips curved into a smile, her eyes shimmering with both tears and joy. Then the circle is complete. They stood together as the sun kissed the horizon, painting the sky in one final blaze of fire before sinking into twilight. Jack wrapped an arm gently around her shoulders, and she leaned into him with quiet certainty. The forest, once his only companion, now seemed to witness something far greater than solitude. It bore witness to love. The birds sang their twilight songs, the air cooling with evening's promise. And for the first time since Jack had built his cabin, the silence around him did not feel heavy. It felt alive, woven with her presence, her laughter, her belief that destiny had led them to one another. As the last sliver of sun disappeared, Ahyoka whispered again, the words now not a fragile breath but a vow, "My chosen one." Jack turned his face toward her, his voice steady, certain, and filled with a peace he had never known. "And mine,"